Good morning, everyone. Thank you ever so much for the introduction. Excuse me, I'm recovering from COVID still. So first of all, thank you so much for our panel joining us today as well. I'll go around and introduce them all in just 1 second. But before I start, if we have any questions at all, please can you post them in the chat at the side, and we'll capture those in the sort of last 10 minutes of the session. So first of all, let's go around the table. So Matt, do you want to go first?
Yes. Hi, thank you for having me. First and foremost, my name is Matthew. Pronouns are he, him. I am Maltese originally, live in Berlin and work for a company called Joker. I'm the Chief Legal and Compliance Officer. We are present predominantly in the Central and South America, and very happy to be here.
Fantastic. Charles?
So morning, everyone. So I'm Charles Hexter. I'm from London originally, but I've lived across the UK. I currently work for Kellogg's as a capital projects manager, with an engineering background, and spend most of my time traveling across Europe, working with all different countries in different countries with different cultures. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic, thank you. And Martin?
Thanks, Kat. Hi, everyone. My name's Martin Pong. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the head of product at Trade Nation. So we're a company that offers customers around the world the access to trade, variety of financial markets through our trading platform. I think I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I think my relationship with masculinity has evolved throughout my lifetime. I'm the eldest son to Chinese parents. I'm also a gay man, so adding that into the mix, and obviously working in the financial services in a male-dominated industry has been an interesting experience. So looking forward to unpack that today.
Fantastic, thank you so much, all of you. So as sort of part of these sort of unwritten rules of masculinity, I created a bit of a word cloud. So feel free to chip in if there's any more I can think of. But those sort of unwritten rules, I had sort of the toxic masculinity, self-absorbing, predator, alpha, money earner, breadwinner, aggressive, protector, provider, to fight and provide for community and to be strong. So as part of this panel, I think we're going to be dispelling that stereotype, and I'm really enjoying going to listen to all of your stories and what your thoughts are on that. So my first question, and Matthew, I'll go to you for this one. So how have the pressures of the unwritten rules that we've just mentioned affected you personally? And do you think these rules have changed over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, just like Martin, I'm also a gay man. So the imposition of what masculinity means has affected my life in various ways. Starting from the fact that I grew up in a very abusive environment. My father was a very abusive man. He was an alcoholic, eventually a drug addict, and his idea of what a man should be was very different to what my idea what a man should be. But obviously, when you're young, you can't deal with that. You don't know how to process it, right? So what I was brought up with until the age of approximately 12, 13, is that a man has to be tough, has to be brute, does not show emotions, is very disloyal to his wife, is violent. This is kind of what a man has to be. And as I was growing up, I also have a brother and a sister, an older brother and a younger sister. And my brother and I are very close in age. We're 1 year apart, roughly. But we're very different characters. So my brother was always very close to my father, whereas I was always very close to my mother. And the characteristics were very different. So he used to use that to put us against each other. And it was always a comparison of that, I am not enough. Why can't you be like your brother? My brother was very into sports, and he was kind of a little playboy, always with different girlfriends, and the rough guy, and getting into fights and so on. And I was always the one, reading and away with my mother. My sister was born, playing with my sister, and all that stuff. And it was not something my father appreciated for various reasons. And he made it very clear. So that kind of as well accentuated what does it mean to be a man, right? And I think it really emphasized, the older I got, the more he became violent. And surprisingly enough, the violence stopped when I retaliated, right? So I was always a quiet one. I was always, okay, let's get beaten up again. Let's kind of be emotionally abused. Let's get harassed. There was never any sexual violence, so that's kind of that get out the window. But when one day I was 14 and I hit back, that's when he stopped. That's when the harassment and the physical violence stopped. And I think, kind of looking back at it now, it was kind of like I earned respect. It kind of like in his masculine mind, there was an element of respect. Oh, okay, he's a man, he fights. But that was never what I felt like. So luckily, my parents split after that time, and then I came out as gay. And coming out as gay was also not the best thing to do, right? For an alpha male type. And I don't have a good relationship with my father now, and we're not on speaking terms. But when I did come out as gay, and I was 18, in a very Catholic country, Malta, for some of you know, it's very Catholic. And back then, we're talking 1998. It's what's not something that you would typically do. And the gay people who I was aware of, at least at the time, were typically drag queens, transsexuals, transvestites, back then called transvestites. So that was the idea of kind of what a gay man is, right? A gay man equals effeminate, equals wants to be a woman, equals, but not being the idea of what a man should be in people's minds. So when I came out as gay, my father obviously assumed I'm now going to become a drag queen. I'm now going to become a transsexual. I'm now going to start wearing women's clothes. And the first thing he said to me was, you should not be gay. You should be, at your age, you should be sleeping around with many women. And I was like, that's kind of okay, but that's not my idea what a man should be. That's your idea of what a man should be. And I don't think with that, right? So that's kind of how I was brought up. As I grew up and I kind of evolved out of that and so on, there were many stereotypes that were imposed on me. I also eventually formed part of the fashion world with modeling and so on. And also that was very interesting. And I kept on thinking about it after our talks as well a couple of days ago. That industry is so messed up for men, right? Because on one side, it's telling you kind of you have to fit a certain, at least back in the 90s and the early 2000s, you have to fit a certain image. You have to be macho, you have to be manly, you have to have a certain physique, and you have to look after your image. And at the same time, it's like, don't look after your image too much, because then you can't be too feminine, right? So kind of like, look good, but don't pluck your eyebrows. Look good, but be careful on what you do and how you do it, because you have to be a man. And that kind of messed me up a lot in hindsight, because what are you trying to be, right? Are you trying to be a man in the way people think you're a man? Are you trying to be yourself? What's going on? And throughout those years, and even until a couple of years ago, I was always very restrained in how I behave and what I say and my body language. And a small thing, I only started crossing my legs when I sit down and being comfortable at crossing my legs about 4 years ago. Because before that, I would never cross my legs. Oh my God, they might realize. They might think I'm gay. They might see what's going on. They might think I'm effeminate or whatever. So it's only kind of through a lot of unlearning that I started doing this, and even body language, the way I sit, the way I behave, the way I talk, the way I use my hands, all of these things, I had to unlearn a lot, and I had to deal with that. And I think the unlearning is happening because society is changing. Right? I think there is a bigger awareness. Admittedly, I live in Berlin, which is a very open, very inclusive culture. Not perfect, far from it, but much better than Catholic Malta in the 90s. And I think that is contributing a lot to it. I also travel a lot for work. At the moment, I go to South America and Central America a lot, which is still a very macho culture. We can discuss that later if we need to. So kind of there is this now distinction. But I also go to New York a lot, and that's also then the other spectrum, right? So kind of you're seeing the diversity, you're seeing the difference in society. And I think it is changing, and I think it's a good thing, obviously. And I think that change is happening for many different factors, right? It's happening because there's a push on diversity and inclusion. There's kind of a lot of final awareness on women's rights, on LGBT rights, on transgender rights, and needs. And I think that this whole discussion now, which is bringing these issues to the fore, is raising the issue of what is the cause of it ultimately, right? What is the cause of this misogyny, of this homophobia? And I think it ultimately boils down to the impressions that people have of what a man should be, what is masculinity. When you kind of look into it, it always kind of emerges as the masculinity that people have been imposed is creating the homophobia, is creating the misogyny. So if we address the root cause of it, then I think we can start improving and we can start actually getting somewhere. But I do think it has been changing, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for sharing. Perfect. Charles, can I come to you? There was something that resonated that Matthew said about traveling around, which is part of the conversation we had previously. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, particularly around so from a travel point of view, it's not only that I travel to factories, so I spend my whole life on construction sites or in factories and things like this, and as you travel to different cultures, it's clear there's different perceptions of what a man should be or what masculinity is, and as a result there's a reality that even the most manly men, or that what people would picture that to be, change as they go to different cultures, right? So they have a toe down or tone up depending on the cultures they're surviving in. And I think this is always an interesting thing to watch. But then actually being in construction and engineering as a whole is heavily male dominated, and it's men. I have a hammer, I have a spanner, I hit things happen, right? And there's a really interesting mentality what's attached to that. And it can be difficult that you have to change your personality depending on the area, the country, the culture, and I think this is a challenge what I've seen since I started working. So I had a very different upbringing to Matthew, right? Came from a nice family, working class family, but we were both, me and my sister were instilled with the idea that you graft, that's what you do. So whether you're male or female, you just have to graft. And I think that's something what I found quite interesting as I joined the engineering world is normally I get away with, even though I might not be, I've got the big buffy hair and I might not wear the same clothes and all the rest of it. If you're seen as a bit of a geezer, I grew up in London, and you have that mentality of a bit of a wheeler dealer, a bit of a grafter, and you morph yourself, and you're happy to continuously morphing yourself. You can integrate extremely well and extremely fast, and especially if you're a bit extrovert and all the rest of it. But what I see is actually, as some of the younger generations have come through, who aren't maybe not had that upbringing, or they're not willing to change and be that chameleon continuously, they really struggle, even in the UK, going from factory to factory. But once they go on the road, it's even more extreme when they can't assimilate. And it is, I can tell a simple story. So a company I've worked for before, it was normal for once the engineers all got together, they would go to the strip club. At the end of the night, go to the strip club. That's what you do. Okay. Then there was a couple of women joined the team. What do? We wait until they're ready to go to sleep, and then we go to the strip club. Okay. And some of them were not really willing. They wanted to be there to the end of the night. And you could see this uncomfortableness where actually the realization is they were still going to go to the strip club and take these women with them, because that's what men do and that's what engineers do, and that's the lifestyle. It's quite funny because in hindsight, I know that the majority of the guys there weren't comfortable with it. That's not how they grew up. That wasn't the lifestyle. But actually, we had this extremely, I am the leader. I'm the man. I grew up they grew up in communist times in Eastern Europe, and that's what I know. That's what we do, and that's what everyone will have fun, and they will integrate, and they will talk. And actually, the reality is that wasn't what people were feeling really uncomfortable. But actually, no one stood up and had a conversation around it. And I think, when I look back on this, there's a strange thing around masculinity, because I don't feel that I'm particularly masculine on a daily basis. But people probably sometimes think that I am, because I might have certain traits or anything. But I think the reality is that I've learned to morph, and that's what affects it. And there is a reality that everyone has to morph and adjust to the situations they're in. But whether it's simple things like, when you're in Poland, for example, you have to walk into the office to shake everyone's hand. There's things what you will naturally do in different places what you want to do there. But the question is, are you fundamentally changing? And I think for some people, they actually do have to fundamentally change who they are on a daily basis to work on the road, right? I think Matthew put it clearly when he talked about the difference going to New York to South America. And I think that is the ongoing reality of working on the road, and you have to decide, if that's like you're willing to do. And I think the reality is, if you're not willing to do that, actually, I don't think in 2022, you can't do certain roles. And then that's actually a massive sadness, because actually there's, good things come from diverse workforce, right? Whether it's mentally diverse, culturally diverse, sexual orientation diverse, or whatever, it really drives the power. But there are still these roadblocks of masculinity. And you sometimes see this with women when they join engineering, actually they become more masculine. So once they're in there, so they'll, some of them I'll be friends with, we go out and they'll wear the dress, and, they'll, choose to drink wine rather than beer. And then they come to a work thing and they're in jeans, hoodie, beer, in a pint, never a half, because otherwise you don't merge in. I think this is the way we push this on others. It's actually quite an interesting thing as well. And actually that's quite difficult to watch at points.
Yeah, I can absolutely resonate with that. So my background is construction and engineering, and as a young gay woman coming into the industry that was very male dominated, I absolutely can feel that I had to twist myself to fit those situations. So being out on site 5 days a week with a group of guys, yes, I drink beer anyway, but yes, it would be a pint. Yes, it would be up until the end of the night. And my language was atrocious, because that's what I heard on site. So therefore, for me to fit in, my language would be the same. And I'd get home at the weekend and my partner would be like, can you just tone it down? Like, every other word is, this isn't you. Why are you doing this? And it's like, because that's how I had to be through the week, again, to sort of almost fit in with that sort of masculine part of the team to get that respect. So Martin, something that Charles just said there about that sort of chameleon effect, that sort of coding, that sort of twisting yourself for situations. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think, like, if you come from a minority background, I think fundamentally you know you're coming from a place of disadvantage, and I think quickly we sort of learn how people perceive different facets of our person. So whether it's our sexuality, our ethnicity, or our mannerisms, the way we present ourselves. And so when we're in situations where we feel like we're not appreciated, or these parts of our true selves are not appreciated, we become very good at this chameleon effect, or code switching, which is sort of like this art of knowing how to switch certain things off, dampen down parts of yourself, or even change parts of ourselves. And I think over life, like I've encountered numerous situations, many in the workplace. Obviously, I've been in financial services for a long time, very male dominated, where I've had to, where I've actively walked into a room, lowered my voice, purposefully tried to dress in a more masculine way, looser clothing, things like that, altered my accent, carefully controlled like which type of emotions I show. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not being my full true self. And I know authenticity is the rave right now. Like but minorities, I don't think we have the privilege to necessarily be our true selves all the time. And unfortunately, the reality is if I act authentically all the time, I won't succeed. I won't be able to survive in these types of cultures, because we're not at that point yet where spaces are safe for real and true authenticity 100% of the time. So yeah, that's sort of my experience.
And in terms of your background as well, Martin, do you want to just give us a bit of a background of your upbringing?
Yeah, so my first encounter, I guess, with masculinity were sort of the expectations put on me as being the eldest and only son in an Asian family. So what that really meant in sort of East Asian culture or Chinese culture was that I was the one who would carry on the family surname. I would be the one who would carry it into further generations. I needed to have a family, biological children, be a father, provide essentially like a strong continuation of this like family lineage. And I think like when I was in my early teens, it really hit me this level of expectation and pressure that I had, like this whole life and expectation of me was ahead. And I did, yeah, from a very young age, I did put a lot of pressure on myself. And over time, I think when you're in that young stage of your life, you sort of slip into that being the norm. And I did just most of the time start prioritizing what others expected of me over what probably was best for myself. So like we talk about all these rules, and I don't think it's necessarily that the rules have changed significantly over time. The idea of masculinity is so deep rooted, and unfortunately, a lot of us just living in the society are unconsciously subscribing to these rules, and as a result, that we're perpetuating it as well. But the fact that we're able to have this open conversation today, the fact that we're unrooting some of these issues means that we are making small steps. But yeah, this really is just the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you, Martin. So the word shame has already been mentioned this morning already. When you realised, each of you, that you didn't sort of conform to that, stereotypical masculine narrative that has been sort of part of your upbringing, how did that sort of make you feel? How did you deal with that sort of? Well, when did you realise that shame, and how did you deal with it? Matthew, I'll come to you first.
Yeah. To be honest, it's always been there. As a gay man, kind of, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I speak for myself. I always knew there was something wrong with me, right? Especially when compared to my brother. My brother was always into his girls and women. I just never got it. So kind of there was that shame of, why am I not like him? Why am I not like my? So the shame in me was kind of always there, boiling down essentially to my sexuality, but also then not meeting my father's expectations, right? Because ultimately, as a young boy, you want to be approved by your father. You're seeking that, right? Okay, I have my mother's approval, and my mother was always a very, very caring and giving person. But my father, I never had his approval. So there was that shame of not meeting that and trying to meet it constantly. And then as I grew older, I think there was it kind of always remained with me, the shame of not being able to be enough in a way, right? Of kind of to be man enough, to be masculine enough. What does it mean? Because it's not in my character. I'm not a person who meets the attributes you mentioned earlier. There's just not in my nature. So then I actually tried to become that, right? I tried to become a bit more aggressive and to be more kind of macho and so on, but it's just not me. So it was actually physically, mentally exhausting, and I decided, not for me. It's just not who I am. And it's only lately that I've kind of, I think the shame has left now, because I accepted myself, I would say, in my late 20s, early 30s, when I started realizing that you have to be yourself, right? If you're not yourself, then you can never really fulfill and grow and be who you want to be and who you need to be. And that trying to please everybody is only going to result in more shame, because you're never going to get everybody's approval. So the shame element for me kind of left when I decided to be who I am, and unapologetically. And yes, there are still times till today where I catch myself kind of restraining and thinking, okay, let's mold to the situation, and then like maybe not. But it's constant. It's a constant struggle. I don't think you ever fully unlearn it, but it is something that you need to be aware of. And And now more of the kind of me being aware of that and not having that shame anymore in who I am is then now kind of transmitting that, right, and helping others, or trying to at least help others also not feel that shame and be themselves and really live their best possible life, because that's the only way that we can make any kind of change in this world. If we are trying to meet people's expectations, if we're trying to fit the mold, then we're only creating problems. And I think this is one of the main issues of masculinity, where men are forced directly and indirectly through societal conditioning of what a man should be. And it boils down to the parents, and indirectly it boils down to the mothers, the wives, the people who are raising young boys and young girls in what to expect from a man, right? So what is a man expected to be? What is a woman expected to be? And pushing this this binary narrative constantly, when I think that kind of there is the masculine traits and the feminine traits are human traits. It's not you're more masculine, I'm more feminine. We're human. We have a different spectrum of emotions, different spectrum of feelings, and how we portray ourselves. And ultimately, that's how it goes. So I know many men, maybe not men, but I know men who are cis, straight, who are effeminate. But up until a couple of years ago, I used to say they must be gay and they're in the closet because they're so effeminate, right? And I think we're all guilty of that. And then I also know many lesbians. Some of my best friends are lesbian women who are super caring, super emotional, very smart, powerful. And you would look at them and you wouldn't think that they're lesbian, because they don't fit the narrative we've been given. The lesbian should be, masculine, not wear skirts, not wear jewelry, kind of be the butch kind of idea of it. But it's not the case. I mean, we're human. And I think we need to break that mold of masculine versus feminine, male versus female. This binary issue is what's causing the issue, right? This is the root cause of the problem, I think. And once we get through that, we can remove the shame, because there is no shame in not adhering to anything, because there's nothing to adhere to. You just have to be yourself. I think that's what we're saying.
And it's definitely a sliding scale, isn't it, in terms of that sort of masculine versus feminine? Again, I think it depends. Yeah, I think I've probably changed a lot through my life in terms of where I sort of slide onto that scale. And I think that's the same with everyone. So it is making sure, isn't it, that it's not masculine, feminine. It's that phase.
Yeah.
Charles, what do you think about that sort of shame piece?
It's interesting. So I grew up, I was a proper emo kid. Yes, I had the makeup, the nails, the rest of it. Was my dad particularly happy about it? No. My dad was in hospital one time, quite serious injury, because he was a worker, used his hands and destroyed his body. And I remember my mum making it really clear, if you're going to the hospital to see him, you can't wear any of this. Okay, fine, whatever. But in general, I was brought up in a household where I have a gay uncle, I have gay cousins and all the rest of it. So it wasn't, the idea of shame wasn't so high. Yeah. But I think it's like, I want to comment on what Matthew said, right? So to finish that point off, sorry, first, I understand, I can see how people would do it, but I've been blessed in a way that may have not been happy all the time and may have felt uncomfortable, but shame is different to feeling out of place, I feel, because it may have been something at the moment and people look at you and whatever, but when I left the situation, it's like what wasn't there. And I think this comes back to a bit of my upbringing is around that. I wasn't brought up in a household where a man's role is to be the provider, or in the traditional sense of you need to have money. The wife stays at home and the husband goes out to work. So we were pretty matriarchal household, right? So when I was little, my dad did work 7 days a week. My mum was a teacher, but her career took off, and she ended up doing really, really well for herself and things like that. So the power struggles of money shifted and it wouldn't know there was struggles, right? But that relationship around who is the breadwinner and making the most money shifted, but it shifted in a really natural way where there was no, this is my money, this is your money, I'm going to go splash it kind of thing. But it's like Matthew said around
Oh, you just gone to mute, Charles.
Sorry, I was touching my scroll pad. This thing around masculinity and femininity, I think we need to be a little bit careful with, that we need to split two things, right? So there's one what's around toxic masculinity and everything what comes with that. There's this thing around, there's a strong is masculinity and femininity the same as gender? Because there's a whole wider topic where even people part of some of the communities would argue over and all the rest of it. And I think we need to be a little bit careful. But Matthew said is 100% correct, though. Actually, a lot of these traits are human traits, and they're the way we've interpreted them. So it's strange. So we spoke previously on the previous call around what are the pieces around masculinity, and not to go into the toxic masculinity piece. So toxic masculinity is something what even people who do display those behaviors know they're a bit risky. So they'll wolf whistle when they're on the builder side, but they wouldn't do that if they're with their girlfriend, for example. They know they're playing outside the rules, but they think it's funny because of an environment they're in. Mm-hmm. But I think there's an issue around actually they're not good, but those are symptomatic of a situation where the fundamental question around masculinity and what does it become? And actually, these are values we should be able to live your life by. And actually, it doesn't need to be, and because we say these are male traits and these are female traits, it gets a bit more complicated. But actually, going back to your word message at the beginning, there was some what were clearly quite toxic masculine. There was some around being a provider, right? What does being a provider mean? That in this day and age, that doesn't mean that you go and work the field, right? Society has evolved past that, and it doesn't need to be just financial. It can be emotional support and all the rest of it. And as people don't, two-career families are becoming a much more common thing. Actually, this is really important that actually, as a result, you could have someone who, with two-career families, that those roles need to change. You can't, the idea that you can just be a provider of cash and you don't take care of children, or you spend your way out of the fact you had an argument, so you buy a gift and everything's good. The society's moved beyond that. And actually, these are, when we boil down and actually say, if you take those traditional things of being strong, or being a provider, or making sure that you create the safety. Actually, the world has changed, and that's not you stand there with an axe at the end of the village. That's not you stand there and make sure that you bring home you go out and kill the gazelle and eat it and stuff like this. That's not how it is anymore. And I think if we can challenge it back to actually what are the human traits, they would merge very close, and then the rest is just around characteristics, and that's a different conversation. And then there's a separate conversation around masculinity is almost a dirty word, but I don't think that's helpful. I think there's a separation between things what people consider are masculine for wrong reasons, and then some people identify them as toxic masculinity, but they are taught behaviors. They're not values. And actually, there's a big difference between your taught behavior and the values what you should be with, right? So I said around where I was brought up, right? My dad worked 7 days a week for most of my childhood, but every Wednesday, he picked me and my sister up from school. We went to McDonald's drive-thru, and then he took her dancing, and me and my dad played. I don't know what we played in the van. We just while I waited for my sister to do it. So he's played both roles, right? And this is the thing, right? He was a provider, he was the caregiver, but actually he was a strong role model for all of us. And that's the bit it needs to be is you have to understand is actually these things are changing, and it's really important that we get on board with the fact they're changing and we talk about it in a different way rather than, I would not call my dad nor masculine. He was he worked with his hand. He was, a tropper. He did panel beating, he fixed cars, he did this, he did all of the male things, but he didn't go down the pub and wolf whistle at women. That's not the way he grew up, and it's because of his upbringing as well. Yeah, and there is this thing Matthew alluded to around generationally, but we need to separate, because good masculinity is used for negative terms, but actually good men is what you're looking for, and good men will still be can still be masculine. They can have feminine values of things, but actually what they are good humans. And that's the key, as well as you'll have a more masculine woman or a more feminine man, but they will still be good humans, and they still have the core traits and the core values. And it's this thing around values versus behaviors, and it's not a conversation what people are willing to have, and that's the bit.
Yeah, perfect. Martin, just to pivot slightly, so in terms of that shame piece, and you mentioned obviously your cultural background, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, so I think, like Charles, Matthew, you've picked up on a really good point. I think the way we wrap up these human traits and behaviors through the enforcement of these stereotypes and the gender binary is sort of like the crux of where I think like these unwritten rules are sort of manifesting. I think if you then layer on the fact that you've got different cultures, different, and off of these, you've got family structures, cultural implications of that. I think it only just amplifies the problems and the pressures and the expectations, and ultimately the shame, that the level of shame it puts on the person. So, like for me, the like sort of a pivoting point for me in my life was sort of the coming out of being gay. It was a huge shift, because being gay completely shattered the Asian expectations of me as being the eldest son in the family. It was basically it was impossible for me to be considered a strong continuation of the family line as a gay man. Like, no matter how hard I tried, no matter what I did, how I behaved, what traits I showed, like the fundamental part was my sexuality was just, it was a brick wall. So yes, I got to the point where yeah, I was ashamed that I would never meet these expectations that I'd felt so strongly since I was a young teenager. But over time, as I matured, as I experienced the world and learned to experience more, I also understood the reality that I lived in. So gay men, we aren't considered strong father figures with families, and that's especially true in Asia. And although we're seeing sort of progress with this example, I think the sort of ideas they're not changing quick enough for someone like me to just sit around and wait for these rules to change and wait for everyone to shift around me. So to sort of, I guess, not be stuck and have to be handcuffed by this shame. I had to go through a sort of reset in my mind, really shifting the way I lived. And I think Matt spoke about this, just sort of throwing out the book on what it means to be male. Like, so no longer living by the rules of what society or what your family expects of you to be a man, or what they define as a man, really just redefining those expectations for yourself. And yeah, I live by my own expectations now, and they're most definitely not defined by my gender.
Amazing. Thank you, Martin. Just to wrap up with a small story that I heard from someone the other day. A guy I work with had been caught speeding, and so he went to a speed awareness course. For some reason, there was a lot of men in the room at the time. They were all, I was doing 130 and a this. He got caught doing 26 and a 20, and he didn't want to tell anyone because, from him, everyone else is, God, I was going so fast, I couldn't believe it. And the fact he was doing 26 in a 20 zone didn't quite have the same gravitas he felt. So he just didn't share it. He kept very quiet and he did his course and he left. But that really resonated with me, that again, even something like that, as a, yes, you've done wrong. It's about speeding is speeding and you shouldn't be doing it. But yeah, that he didn't want to come out with that. So slight pivot again to talk about emotions. And it was brought up again, something this morning. So I recently did a call with a trans man called George, who is absolutely fantastic. And he was saying that before he transitioned, he would literally cry at the drop of a hat, an advert with a puppy on it, the John Lewis advert now, he'd be absolutely bawling in tears. But as he went through his transition, and he's been on testosterone for 10 years now, he said that he can count the amount of times he's cried on one hand. It's almost like it does not come out. And he thinks it's because of that testosterone piece. Do you guys feel sort of psychologically safe to share your emotions, in private, in public? And has that changed over time as well? And Martin, I'll come to you first on that one.
Yeah, so I think like working in the financial services is a very Yeah, it's one of the oldest and most influential industries, right, in the world. And I think with that, the stereotype of the successful white male banker is so deeply entrenched in not just our industry, but it's like trickled over to other industries. And I don't think this stereotype impacts how we expect just men to act. It's how we expect everyone to act, whether you're woman, non-binary, trans. And I think what that puts on us is obviously it sets the scene. It puts on an expectation of how we expect to see success. And if you don't show the traits or characteristics that adhere to that stereotype, are you really in a safe environment where you can show your true emotions? And unfortunately, that's been the case for the past number of decades, right? What we see now is a result of everyone sort of conforming to be one type of person, and that's all driven by this sort of toxic stereotype. So essentially, all the boardrooms, they just become echo chambers. Everyone thinks and behaves in the same way. But luckily, we like the financial services anyway. We're starting to see sort of a slight shift. I think financial services, being one industry that's driven by money, has sort of realised that the diversity element is actually is commercially viable. So people are willing to go out of their way to sort of embrace diversity and sort of loosen the stereotype. But in terms of being psychologically safe, I think what you really need to do, I think, whether you're as a company or you're providing an environment for anyone to be in, is sort of understanding that as men, women, non-binary, trans people, we're all subjected to these expectations, and you want to provide an environment where people can be as authentic as they can be. I don't think we'll ever get to, or not in the short term, won't get to a point where people can be that 100% of the time, but it's creating those environments more frequently, creating them as openly as possible, and just offering that safe space where people can show all the ranges of emotions, all facets of their person, and just means that they don't need to conform or code switch to really survive in a workplace or any other space.
Brilliant. Charles, can you add to that?
Yeah. So, do I cry at work? Not regularly. To be
Not if you can help
honest. No. Do I cry? Yeah. I mean, DIY SOS, where they build houses for these people who have had horrific things happen to them, tears me up every time. And I'm a strong believer that every so often you do need a good cry. But emotions at work are difficult, right? And I think it is tough to find the balance. And I think we need to, there's this thing around what is professionalism. Okay, there's a question around that. But the reality is, if you're sad and upset, you're sad and upset. And actually, there's a thing around, if you break down in the middle of a construction site, say, that's not okay, right? Because it's not safe. That the reality is, if you're in emotional distress, you can't be near these situations. It's too dangerous for you. And so I think for me, that there's important things around knowing your safe space and making sure your work environment has a safe space. But it's, I didn't grow up seeing men cry. It's a reality. But there was no issue when if I was upset, I was quite an emotional child at times, and, I got bullied for a couple of years and things, and it really does affect you. And I think it's difficult, and it needs to be a much more open conversation. So I remember one of the factories I used to work at, there was a production manager who was a woman, and she cried daily, and it was uncomfortable. And she had some horrific things happening, but actually she had no support system. The business didn't provide any support system for her. So she literally just broke down every day. And actually, there's a thing around, you can be sad and you can be happy, but actually once you're beyond those points in true emotional distress, actually, I think it's a wider conversation around how we manage mental health in the workplace. But if you cannot cry, that's a different issue. So if you feel like you cannot create and you cannot display even in your own safe space, I think that's a really sad thing. And I think it shows dramatically why there's such an issue with men's mental health, because there's a reality of, I went through some quite difficult times during, coincided with COVID. It was nothing to do with COVID, but during that kind of time frame. And I went and got therapy. There was a clear thing that actually I don't want to be in a situation where it's hard work being depressed. It's hard work being anxious. And actually, I felt that it was important for me to step out, because I had to practice what I preach around finding help and all the rest of it. And that's a really important thing. But actually, if no one's around you who is preaching those things around, it's okay to do it. And I actually have a friend who turned to microdosing LSD as a way to deal with anxiety, right? It has scientific benefits and all the rest of it, but fundamentally that's a plaster rather than getting the therapy of the issues he's going through. And I think this comes back to the fact that he's, from an Indian background. It's not accepted in that culture to find that support and help. And I think, it's a strange situation when I reflect on his situation, to choose to take, psychoactive drugs rather than get some help, because that's not what you do. It shows that there is a damaged or broken system there. But I think, if anyone takes anything from this, especially when we speak around mental health and male mental health, is actually there's a huge amount of stuff on YouTube, on podcasts and all the rest of it. And it's really important, if you feel that you don't have ups, highs and lows, and they come out in something, that you're not happy when you don't do that belly laugh once a day or once a week, and you don't have that cry when things are really bad. Actually, maybe it's time to reflect, actually, is that right? And is that the same as you were when you were a child? And if societal pressures have changed you, actually that's something what can, maybe you need to take the time to reflect. And I think that's something what men do very poorly. I don't think that's a masculine thing. I do think that's a male thing, though. I have some very, very effeminate male friends who are very, very, really to the extreme of, drag queen style, and that's their persona the whole time. That's not something they change to. That is their persona, without the dress up and the actual visual change. And they still struggle to cry. They still struggle to have actual proper conversations around the highs and lows of their daily lives. So I think there is an important discussion to be had on that, especially with the increase in suicide rates. And I sadly this week actually was told around a couple of students who in the Netherlands decided, due to the situation when they're 22, they're a friend of a friend's child, and they've jumped in front of a train, two of them together. With the most worrying thing was the same day, different locations, so it wasn't a suicide pact or anything like that. And I think actually, if we can't have that conversation, it's very difficult.
So very poignant, given it's November this month. I know we've been celebrating at work. I'm conscious we've got 10 minutes left, but Matthew, I'd really like to get your point on that as well.
Yeah, I won't take long time, because I think Martin and Charles touched on the salient issues, right? And I completely agree with both of you. I will try to the scientific element. Do the hormones affect? And honestly, I have no clue. I do have a doctorate, but it's not a medicine. So I have no idea about that. But as I said, I think Martin and Charles touched on the most pertinent elements here, right? And I do think that, yes, as men, we are preconditioned not to cry. Boys don't cry, men don't cry, right? Showing our emotions is something that has been always restrained from us, because that's what we need to be. Is what we're told. And the emotional people are the women, right? And the men are the strong guys who kind of always face their fears and go out and get it done. So then, kind of when we need to cry, it is a resistance. And personally speaking, yes, I love crying, but I can't. It's super difficult for me to cry, right? Even when I'm in therapy and kind of talking about history and emotional things, I find it so difficult to cry, and it's so frustrating that you want to, because it's a release, and ultimately crying is a release, right? You need to get it out because you need to deal with it, but it's so challenging. I'm lucky enough to have two partners. I'm in a polyamorous relationship, so I have two male partners. We live together, and I'm lucky that they are They are very, obviously very emotional, but kind of like they're in touch with their emotions. With them, we've been together for 4 years, and I am still building towards the safe space. They provide it. It's just me who's resisting, right, and kind of not wanting to show vulnerability, even though I know that you need to show vulnerability. So it is a lot of the unlearning, right? The unlearning, the unpacking, and dealing with that. Being emotional at work, I have never visibly cried at work. I have had panic attacks and I have cried, but I have gone to the toilet, I have left the building and done that externally, but never at the office, because I don't want to be vulnerable, right? And I'm guilty of this. And when people in my past, at least, have cried at work, I perceive that at that time as a sign of weakness. Do you want these people, at least in my history, women, around at work when they cannot handle the pressure? That's kind of how you're trained to deal with it, right? Whereas obviously now I don't see it that way. And in my team, if people in my team have cried to me, it's for me, that's kind of like jump to action and, and comfort them and see how can you help them. Whereas before it was always, oh my God, she can't handle it. Which is how we have been trained ultimately, and which is why I think that men do not cry, because they will not be perceived. They think they will not be perceived, or they will not be perceived as being fit for the job. But we need to change that, and we need to. And I'm guilty of it. As I said, I'm working on it. It's a work in progress. That I need to actually cry visibly.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. Okay, we've had a couple of comments. If there's any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can in 6 minutes. So we've had a comment from Jess Potts. I've worked in an engineering industry, and strip clubs at the end of the night are one of the norm. But I have seen so many men being uncomfortable to go along and scared to challenge the status quo in male-dominated industries with men in positions of power. Thank you for sharing, Charles. I think that's, I could definitely think that resonates. I never got taken to a strip club, but there was a lot of very late nights, again, because you felt you had to be part of the team. So thank you, Jess, for sharing that. We've got a question as well. For many of us, we've grown up playing different versions of ourselves, as Martin, Matthew, and Charles have shared. How are you unpicking these to heal and become closer to your true selves? Martin, if you want to take that one first.
Yeah. So I've spoken a lot about like code switching, and yes, it's sad that we have to do it. And it's not the nicest thing to be like not being able to be your full true self. But I also think, like, unfortunately, this is the situation, the world that we're living in, and yes, we are making progress. But I try to look at things with a positive light, and like, I think as minorities, we have the ability to be that chameleon, to change. We are more in touch with how people perceive us. That gives us greater level of self-awareness, greater level of being in touch with who we are, our emotions, and things like that. And I think these are all things that we've been forced to sort of develop as people from minority backgrounds. And I think if you look at it that way, these are just strengths to our characters. And I've been able to use this in all aspects of my life to sort of succeed in what I do at work, but also build like really strong friendships and relationships. So I think, it's unfortunate that we have to do this, we're put in this position, but I don't think it's all necessarily negative.
Perfect. Thank you. Charles, in 2 minutes for you.
For me, I think one of the big things around, especially on that comment, the healing piece, for me, this is really important to have a level of privilege, right? So I'm white, as you can all see, I'm male. I'm in a heterosexual marriage, but I'm of the Jewish faith, right? But actually, that's not something people see. So there's a lot of prejudice against it and all the rest of it, but people don't see that on a daily basis. Okay. I think for me, one of the big things around healing around this is about making sure that I use those privileges to give other people the voice. And this is something that, I actively do as part of my work during Kellogg's, and I think this is key. And I think that helping others is allowing myself to heal. Coming closer to my truest self in the workplace, I think for me is still a long way away in reality, and I'm not going to deny that. And I think the big thing is about being my truest self outside, and then being able to have more conversations around it. But I think that is something fundamentally difficult, and something what ideologically I struggle with actually is the work, so there's part of me that goes, actually everyone should be able to turn up and do whatever, be themselves. But at the same time, it's actually like there's this bit in the back of my head that goes, yeah, but actually if you have standardization, it's much more harmonious, because actually you don't have to have that conversation. As a result, people just turn up and do their job. From a mental health point of view, that's not good. From a operational point of view, that can be. And I think this is something that I'm still struggling with, because I do want to have these conversations at work, and I do think it's really important. But then sometimes I understand why companies don't want to talk around it. I fundamentally do understand that. And not that that's right, but it's just one of those challenges I have.
Thank you, Charles. Matt, 1 minute for you.
It gets shorter and shorter. No, I mean, I think the only way to do that, what I try to work with, is I keep myself in check, or at least I try to. And when I start seeing kind of certain behaviors, certain thoughts, certain attitudes, I start questioning: is this who I want to be, or is this more of a result of my past, ultimately, right? And that's a constant check that I kind of try to keep myself in. I fail very often, and then I realize kind of after I failed, and sometimes I apologize, and sometimes I'm a man and I don't apologize. I think it's a constant struggle that we all have to go through. I'm not special about this, right? We all have to deal with them. But I think being aware of it, reading, learning, talking, and trying to unlearn is the only way we can actually do this. There isn't a magical pill you're going to take, or a course you're going to take, and suddenly wake up and I'm being my true self. It's a struggle, and to be honest, what I have found is that the more I talk about it, the more I talk about my history, my challenges, my obstacles, the better I become at it, because I start kind of, in a way, convincing myself that it's okay. And then you start realizing that people are actually open to it. People are open to understanding, are open to dialogue. And yes, you will find people who object, and people who perhaps give you the cold shoulder, but the majority of people don't. The majority of people are very open to it. I'm lucky enough to work in a company that is super inclusive and diverse. It's encouraged. We have a fantastic team, even though we're in Central South America. It is not a macho culture. It's very, very open. And these are things that I think help a lot when you surround yourself with people who are of the same opinion, or of the same, at least on the same wavelength, or are open to discussion, open to dialogue, and that's when change starts happening.
Fantastic. I think you summed up perfectly. Personally, thank you so much for this. This has been one of the best panels I think I've done. I've learned so much, and as a mother of a 12-year-old son, I feel there's so much I can do with him now to make sure that this doesn't affect him as he has his journey through life as well, finding out who he is. So thank you very much for your vulnerability as well, and I will hand over. I think there's a break now. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.